Artificial neural networks, or simulated neural networks, are also referred to simply as neural networks, and they constitute an important subfield of machine learning. Deep learning, also known as deep artificial neural networks, is a type of artificial neural network with multiple layers of network structure. The basic structure and algorithms of neural networks form the core content of deep learning. Both their name and structure are inspired by the human brain, simulating some of the mechanisms of the human brain. In this episode, we will introduce the basic principles and commonly used network structures of neural networks as clearly as possible, as well as their application scenarios. In a neural network, the most basic unit is the neuron. It receives inputs from other neurons and generates output through an activation function. Each neuron receives a set of inputs and a bias value, and each input is associated with a weight, which is multiplied by the signal when it arrives. Together with the bias, these are passed as parameters to the activation function to generate the output. The bias can be seen as an adjustable threshold for the model, serving several purposes. 1. Enhancing the expressive power of the model. 2. Increasing the flexibility of the model. 3. Ensuring that the activation function operates in the nonlinear region. 4. Preventing overfitting of the model. The role of an activation function is to generate output based on the inputs and bias. Depending on the situation, different activation functions can be chosen. The primary purpose of using different activation functions is to introduce nonlinearity, addressing the limitation of linear models in expressing complex relationships. Different activation functions endow neurons with different capabilities. However, it's important to note that each activation function has its own pros and cons, with some being less effective and others requiring significant computational resources. A neural network consists of multiple neurons organized in a hierarchical structure. Neurons within the same layer typically collaborate to perform a specific function. It's important to note that when computing the number of layers, we usually exclude layers that don't contribute to computation. Therefore, in the simplest single-layer neural network, we only have the output layer. For example, in a two-layer neural network, we have one hidden layer and one output layer. In a multi-layer or deep neural network, we have multiple hidden layers. The depth of a network refers to the number of layers it has. The term deep learning originates from this concept. The learning process of a neural network can be divided into two stages: forward propagation and back propagation. During forward propagation, the network takes input data and calculates the final output through a series of computations involving neurons and weights. Forward propagation is essentially the inference process of the neural network. In backpropagation, the network calculates the error between the output and the actual labels. Then, based on this error and the optimization algorithm used, it adjusts the weights to minimize the error. These two steps are repeated iteratively until the error falls within the desired range. Note, the backpropagation mechanism is one of the most important inventions in the entire field of neural networks. Without backpropagation, we wouldn't have witnessed the current boom in deep learning. People have long understood the structure and basic functioning of neurons in the brain, leading to the development of the perceptron. However, the mechanism of how neurons in the brain learn remained elusive for a long time. In order to address the learning problem in artificial neural networks, backpropagation was invented by several artificial intelligence scientists. Its effectiveness was later demonstrated by Geoffrey Hinton and others, sparking the surge in deep learning over the past decade or so. In backpropagation, two important components are essential: the loss function and the optimization algorithm. We use a loss function to measure the difference between the network's predictions and the actual labels. Similar to activation functions, there are various functions to choose from. Selecting an appropriate loss function that accurately describes the similarity between the output and training data can make the training process more efficient and reduce the number of iterations required. The optimization algorithm is then used to update the weights in order to minimize the loss function. We have discovered several optimization algorithms, each with its own advantages and disadvantages. With the backpropagation mechanism in place, we can proceed to train the neural network. Both the weights and biases can be initialized before training and adjusted during the training process. However, adjusting the biases is often more critical, and the update of biases typically does not depend on the input. It is relatively independent of the current state of the network. With an understanding of the concepts mentioned above, we know that to build a neural network, we need to consider the following aspects. 1. Network structure, including the connectivity of neurons and the depth of the network. 2. Selection of activation functions for neurons. 3. Initialization values before learning starts, especially the threshold bias of neurons. 4. Selection of loss functions and optimization algorithms during the learning and training process. Knowing these, you are now an entry-level artificial intelligence expert.